In the dusty frontier town of Copper Ridge, everyone walked past her like she was invisible. An old woman, confused and lost at the trading post, clutching a worn leather bag while folks hurried by without a second glance. But when 19-year-old Jake Thornfield, a broke ranch hand with nothing but the clothes on his back and his father's old horse, stopped to help her find her way home, he had no idea he was about to discover the most shocking secret in the entire valley. What happened next would change his life forever, because this wasn't just any lost old woman. She was Martha Whitmore, and she owned half of everything he could see for miles around. But first, Jake would have to risk losing the only roof over his head, ride through dangerous mountain passes in the dead of night, and make a choice that would cost him everything he had. This is the story of how one act of kindness in the Wild West led to the most unexpected twist you'll ever hear, and why sometimes the people who seem to have the least are the ones willing to give the most. The autumn sun hung low over Copper Ridge that evening, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings that lined the main street. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and dust, mixed with the distant sound of cattle lowing in the valley below. It was the kind of evening that whispered of winter's approach, when smart folks hurried to finish their business before the mountain cold settled in for good. Jake Thornfield guided his father's old horse, Dusty, down the rutted main street, his worn leather saddlebags heavy with the day's final delivery. At 19, Jake carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned early that life didn't hand out favors. His clothes were patched but clean, his boots scuffed from years of hard work, and his hat, the only thing of real value he owned, had been his father's before consumption took him 2 winters back. Since then, Jake had scraped by, working as a ranch hand at the Broken Spur, doing whatever jobs needed doing, mending fences, herding cattle, breaking horses that other men wouldn't touch. The pay was barely enough to keep him fed and sheltered, but it was honest work, and Jake had learned to be grateful for what little he had. That evening, like most evenings, he'd taken on extra work delivering supplies from Jameson's trading post to the scattered homesteads around the valley. Old Pete Jameson paid him 50 cents per delivery, and every coin mattered. Tonight's delivery would give Jake just enough to pay his weekly bunk fee at the Broken Spur. Without it, he'd be sleeping under the stars, and with winter coming on, that was a death sentence in these mountains. Jake had one last stop to make, a bag of medicine and supplies for the widow Henderson, whose cabin sat a good hour's ride up the mountain trail. If he could get there and back before full dark, he'd have his rent money and a roof over his head for another week. If not, well, Jake had learned not to think too hard about the if-nots in life. He was just tying Dusty to the hitching post outside Jameson's when something caught his eye. The trading post's covered porch, usually empty this time of evening, had a lone figure sitting on the wooden bench. An elderly woman in a faded blue dress and tattered shawl, her silver hair escaping from what had once been a neat bun. She clutched a worn leather bag in her lap and kept looking up and down the street, like she was waiting for someone who should have been there hours ago. Jake had seen her there when he'd picked up the delivery an hour earlier. Folks had walked past her all afternoon. Ranchers heading home, shopkeepers closing up, families hurrying to finish their errands. But nobody had stopped. Nobody had even looked at her twice. In a town where everyone knew everyone, that struck Jake as mighty strange. The woman's weathered hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her shawl against the evening chill. Her eyes, clouded with age and confusion, searched the empty street with the kind of desperate hope that made Jake's chest tighten. He'd seen that look before, in his father's eyes during those final weeks, when the medicine stopped working and all they could do was wait. Jake checked his pocket watch, a dented brass piece that had belonged to his grandfather. 6:30. If he left now, he could make the Henderson place and back with time to spare. His rent money, his bed, his future for the next week. It all depended on completing this one last ride. But something about the old woman's stillness, her quiet desperation, made him hesitate with his foot already in the stirrup. Jake stood there for a long moment, one boot in the stirrup, watching the old woman on the porch. The smart thing would be to mount up and ride hard for the Henderson place. Every minute he delayed was a minute closer to full darkness, and these mountain trails were treacherous enough in daylight. But something about her posture, the way she sat so still, yet alert, like a lost child trying to be brave, tugged at something deep in his chest. Against his better judgment, Jake stepped down from Dusty and approached the porch. His spurs clinked softly against the wooden steps as he climbed up, removing his hat out of respect. "Evening, ma'am," he said gently, not wanting to startle her. "You waiting for someone?" The woman looked up at him with eyes that seemed to peer through fog. For a moment, she studied his face like she was trying to place him in a memory that wouldn't quite come clear. Then she smiled, a small, uncertain thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I think so," she said, her voice soft and wavering. "Or maybe they're waiting for me. I'm not entirely sure anymore." She looked down at the leather bag in her lap, then back up at the empty street. "I was supposed to meet someone about a wagon, or maybe it was a stagecoach. The details seemed to slip away like water through my fingers." Jake knelt down beside the bench, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, he could see the fine quality of her dress beneath the dust and wear. The fabric was good, better than anything most folks in Copper Ridge could afford. Her hands, though weathered, showed no signs of the hard labor that marked most frontier women. There was something about her that didn't quite fit with being alone and forgotten on this porch. "What's your name, ma'am?" Jake asked kindly. "Martha," she replied, then hesitated. "Martha. Whitmore, I believe. Yes, that sounds right." She touched her throat absently, and Jake noticed a delicate silver locket hanging from a thin chain. "I live up in the canyon somewhere, Eagles Canyon, I think, or maybe it's Eagles Ridge. The names all sound so similar." Jake's breath caught. Eagles Canyon was a good 3 hours' ride from town, up treacherous mountain passes that were dangerous even for experienced riders. In the dark, with winter weather coming in, it would be near impossible, and for an elderly woman alone. "Ma'am, Eagles Canyon is quite a ways from here," Jake said carefully. "How did you get to town today?" Martha's brow furrowed in concentration. "I remember riding in something. A wagon, perhaps? There was a young man, my ranch hand, I think. He was supposed to wait for me, but—" She looked around the empty street again. "Maybe he forgot. Or maybe I forgot to tell him when to come back." Her voice grew smaller. "I seem to forget a lot of things these days." Jake felt his heart sink. The woman was clearly confused, maybe touched by the sun or suffering from one of those mind ailments that sometimes took older folks. But she seemed harmless enough, just lost and scared. And if she really did live up in Eagles Canyon, she was in serious danger. The temperature would drop fast once the sun set, and mountain lions had been spotted in the area recently. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jake said gently, "is there anyone in town who might know you? Someone who could help get word to your family?" Martha shook her head slowly. "I don't think so. I don't come to town very often anymore. Used to when my husband was alive, but that was a long time ago." She looked at Jake with sudden clarity. "You have kind eyes, young man. Like my grandson used to have. He wore his hat the same way you do, respectful-like, but proud." Jake glanced toward Dusty, then up at the darkening sky. The smart play was still to wish her well and ride for the Henderson place. Someone else would come along eventually. The sheriff made his evening rounds. He'd sort this out. But as Jake looked at Martha's face, he saw his own grandmother in her features. Grandma Rose had gotten confused near the end too, forgetting names and places, and she'd died alone because everyone was too busy to sit with her. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jake heard himself saying, "would you like me to help you get home?" Martha's face brightened with such genuine relief that Jake felt his chest tighten. "Oh, would you? That's very kind of you, dear. I'd be so grateful." Then her expression clouded again. "But it's quite far, I think, and getting dark. I wouldn't want to impose." Jake looked up at the sky, watching the last golden light fade behind the mountain peaks. Eagles Canyon was at least 3 hours away on horseback, maybe 4 with an elderly passenger. The trail wound through Devil's Pass, a narrow mountain route that was treacherous in daylight and downright deadly in the dark. Wild animals, loose rock, and drop-offs that could kill a man if his horse took one wrong step. More than that, Jake would need to ride back alone in complete darkness, assuming he could even get Martha home safely. By the time he returned to town, it would be well past midnight. The Henderson delivery would be impossible, and without that 50 cents, he'd be sleeping in the cold come morning. Jake checked his pocket watch again. 6:45. He could still make the Henderson place if he left right now. Mrs. Henderson was expecting her medicine. She'd been fighting a fever for days, and Jake needed that money. Winter was coming, and jobs would be scarce once the snow started falling. One missed payment could mean weeks of sleeping rough, assuming he survived the cold at all. But as he looked at Martha's hopeful face, Jake knew he couldn't walk away. She reminded him too much of his grandmother, and more than that, she was someone's family. Somewhere up in Eagles Canyon, people were probably worried sick about her. If his own grandmother had been lost and confused in a strange town, he'd want someone to help her home, no matter the cost. "Don't you worry about imposing, Mrs. Whitmore," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'd be honored to see you home safe." He helped her to her feet, noting how frail she felt beneath the worn fabric of her dress. As they walked toward Dusty, Jake's mind raced through the logistics. His horse was strong, but getting on in years. Carrying 2 riders up mountain trails would be hard on the animal, especially with winter feed running low. Jake would need to take it slow and careful. "Now, I should warn you," Jake said, as he helped Martha up behind him in the saddle. "This is going to be a long ride. The trails up to Eagles Canyon aren't exactly comfortable, especially riding double. You sure you're up for it?" Martha settled herself behind him with surprising grace. "Young man, I've been riding these mountains since before you were born. I may be a little confused about some things these days, but I know how to sit a horse." She wrapped her arms around his waist with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. As they rode out of Copper Ridge, Jake caught sight of old Pete Jameson locking up his trading post for the night. Pete raised a hand in farewell, and Jake touched his hat brim in response. By tomorrow, Pete would know that Jake had missed the Henderson delivery. Word would get back to the Broken Spurs foreman, and Jake's reputation for reliability would take a hit. In a town this small, reputation was everything. The trail began climbing almost immediately as they left the valley floor. Dusty's breathing grew heavier with each switchback, and Jake could feel the horse's stride shortening under the double load. Behind him, Martha hummed softly, an old hymn that Jake recognized from Sunday services back when his parents were alive. "You know," Martha said as they crested the first ridge, "I haven't had a proper escort in years. My grandson used to ride with me everywhere when he was about your age. Taught him to sit a horse on these very trails." Her voice grew wistful. "He had plans, that boy. Was going to start his own spread, maybe run for territorial legislature someday, but the fever took him 2 summers back." Jake felt Martha's grip tighten slightly around his waist, and he realized she was crying silently. He didn't say anything, just kept Dusty moving steady and sure up the mountain path, while behind him an old woman grieved for dreams that would never come true. Behind him, Martha had grown quiet except for the occasional soft direction. "Bear left at that lightning-struck pine," she'd say, or, "There's a shortcut through that gap in the rocks." Despite her confusion in town, she seemed to know these trails by heart, and Jake found himself grateful for her guidance as the familiar landmarks disappeared into shadow. They'd been climbing for over an hour when Martha spoke again, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. "You know, I used to ride this trail twice a week when I was younger. Down to town for supplies, church on Sundays, social gatherings. My husband always said I was too independent for my own good, riding these mountains alone." She chuckled softly. "He was probably right, but I never could stand being cooped up at the ranch all the time." "How long have you lived up in Eagles Canyon, Mrs. Whitmore?" Jake asked, partly to keep her talking and partly because something about her story didn't quite add up. Most of the homesteads in Eagles Canyon were small affairs, a cabin, maybe a few head of cattle, not the kind of place that would have ranch hands. "Oh goodness, let me think," Martha said. "Thomas and I built the main house it must have been 1855, just after we were married. Started with nothing but a claim and a dream." Her voice grew distant with memory. "Thomas had a vision, you see. Said this valley would be worth a fortune someday, when the railroad came through. He was always thinking ahead, always planning." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The main house, built in 1855, that would make it one of the oldest and largest spreads in the territory. And if her husband had been buying up land since then. "Thomas was smart about the water rights too," Martha continued, seemingly unaware of Jake's growing amazement. "Bought up all the land around Willow Creek before folks realized how important water would be out here. Said whoever controlled the water would control the valley." She paused. "I think he was right about that." Willow Creek fed half the ranches in the valley, including the broken spur where Jake worked. If Martha's family controlled those water rights, they controlled the livelihood of every rancher for miles around. That would make her one of the wealthiest people in the territory, certainly not someone who should be wandering around town alone and confused. They crested another ridge, and Jake could see lights twinkling in the distance, the first sign of civilization they'd encountered since leaving Copper Ridge. But these weren't the scattered lights of a small homestead. They looked like the windows of a big house, maybe even a mansion by frontier standards. "Almost home," Martha said with satisfaction. "I can see the house lights. Samuel must be worried sick. He's probably got half the ranch hands out, looking for me by now." As they drew closer, Jake could make out the silhouette of buildings against the star-filled sky. What he saw made his jaw drop. This wasn't just a ranch house, it was practically a compound. A large two-story house with covered porches and multiple wings, surrounded by barns, bunkhouses and corrals that seemed to stretch on forever. Even in the darkness, Jake could tell this was the kind of spread that most ranchers could only dream of owning. Dusty's hooves echoed on cobblestones as they entered what appeared to be a formal courtyard. Gas lamps flickered along a curved driveway, and Jake could see well-tended gardens and ornamental trees, luxuries almost unheard of in this rugged country. This wasn't just wealth, this was an empire. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jake said carefully, "exactly how much land do you and your family own?" Martha was quiet for a moment, then spoke with a clarity that surprised him. "Oh, I suppose it's about half the valley these days, maybe a bit more. Thomas was always adding to it, and I kept buying parcels after he passed. The lawyer handles most of it now, too much for an old woman to keep track of." Jake felt his world tilt sideways as the full magnitude of what she'd just said hit him. Before Jake could fully process Martha's revelation, the front door of the grand house burst open, spilling warm yellow light across the courtyard. A tall, weathered man in his 50s rushed out, followed by two younger ranch hands carrying lanterns. "Miss Martha," the older man called out, his voice thick with relief and worry. "Thank the Lord you're safe. We've had men searching every trail between here and town." He hurried to Dusty's side, reaching up to help Martha down from the saddle. "Oh, Samuel, don't fuss so," Martha said, though Jake could hear the affection in her voice. "This kind young man brought me home. I'm perfectly fine." Samuel, who Jake assumed was the foreman Martha had mentioned, looked up at Jake with eyes that were both grateful and assessing. "Name's Samuel Davies," he said, extending a calloused hand. Mrs. Whitmore's ranch foreman. Can't thank you enough for bringing her home safe." Jake dismounted and shook the man's hand, noting the firm grip and the way Davies carried himself with quiet authority. Jake Thornfield was happy to help. "Samuel, this young man rode all the way up from Copper Ridge to see me home," Martha said, as Davies wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "In the dark, no less. We need to offer him supper and a place to stay the night." "Oh no, ma'am, that's not necessary," Jake said quickly, though the offer was tempting. The thought of riding back down those treacherous mountain trails in complete darkness made his stomach clench. "I need to get back to town tonight." Davies studied Jake's face in the lamplight. "Son, it's past 9 o'clock and black as pitch out there. Those trails are dangerous enough in daylight. You try to ride them at night, we'll be sending out search parties for you come morning." But Jake was already swinging back into Dusty's saddle. He had to get back. The Henderson delivery was shot, but maybe if he rode hard enough, he could catch old Pete before he went to bed and explain the situation. Maybe Pete would understand, give him another chance. "I appreciate the offer, but I've got responsibilities back in town," Jake said. "You take care of yourself, Mrs. Whitmore." Martha reached out and touched his stirrup. "You're a good boy, Jake Thornfield. Your parents raised you right." She looked up at him with those clouded eyes that sometimes seem to see more than they should. "I won't forget what you've done for me tonight." The ride back down the mountain was a nightmare. Without Martha's guidance and with only starlight to see by, Jake had to let Dusty pick his way carefully down the narrow trail. Every shadow looked like a cliff edge. Every sound made him think of mountain lions or bears. Twice, loose rocks skittered away under Dusty's hooves, echoing into the darkness below. By the time Jake finally made it back to Copper Ridge, it was well past midnight. The town was dark and silent, not even a dog barking to mark his return. Jake rode straight to the broken spur, his heart sinking as he saw no lights in the foreman's cabin. He'd have to wait until morning to explain why he'd missed the Henderson delivery. At the bunkhouse, Jake dismounted on unsteady legs and reached for the latch on the door. It didn't budge. He tried again, thinking maybe the cold had warped the wood. Still nothing. Then he noticed the new padlock hanging from the door handle, gleaming dully in the starlight. A sick feeling settled in Jake's stomach as he walked around to the side of the building. There, sitting on the ground next to the wall, was a canvas sack containing his few belongings: a spare shirt, his father's old Bible, a tin cup, and the daguerreotype of his parents on their wedding day. Pinned to the sack was a note written in the foreman's blocky handwriting: "Missed delivery. No excuses. Find new arrangements." Jake stood there in the cold darkness, holding his possessions in a canvas sack, with nowhere to go and less than $2 in his pocket. Dusty nuzzled his shoulder, as if sensing his rider's despair. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd just delivered the wealthiest woman in the valley safely home to her mansion, and now he was homeless. Jake spent that first night in the hayloft of Morrison's stable, curled up in horse blankets that smelled of leather and hay. Old man Morrison found him there at dawn, shivering and embarrassed. But the grizzled stable owner just grunted and told him he could stay as long as he mucked out stalls, and kept his mouth shut about it. For 3 days, Jake survived on odd jobs and charity. He hauled water for the laundry, split wood for the hotel, and helped load freight wagons at the depot. The work paid barely enough for meals, and Jake went to bed each night with his stomach only half full. Word had gotten around about his missed delivery, and none of the other ranchers would hire him. In a town where reliability meant everything, Jake's reputation was ruined. On the 4th morning, as Jake was carrying feed buckets across the stable yard, a familiar black buggy rolled into town. It was finer than anything Copper Ridge usually saw: polished wood with brass fittings and pulled by 2 matched bay horses that probably cost more than most folks made in a year. The driver was Samuel Davies, looking crisp and official in a dark suit and vest. He pulled up in front of Jameson's trading post and stepped down, scanning the street until his eyes found Jake standing frozen beside the feed trough. "Jake Thornfield," Davies called out, his voice carrying across the morning quiet. "Mrs. Whitmore would like a word with you." Jake set down the feed buckets and walked over slowly, acutely aware of his patched clothes and the hay sticking to his hair. Several townspeople had stopped to watch, including old Pete Jameson, who stood in his doorway with undisguised curiosity. "Mr. Davies," Jake said, touching his hat brim respectfully, "is Mrs. Whitmore all right?" "She's fine, thanks to you," Davies replied, "but she's been asking about you every day since you brought her home. When she heard from folks in town that you'd lost your position." He shook his head. "Well, she insisted I come find you immediately." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. The last thing he wanted was charity from the woman he'd helped. "That's kind of her, but I'm getting by fine." Davies gave him a look that suggested he could see right through that lie. "Son, Mrs. Whitmore doesn't extend invitations lightly. She'd like you to come up to the ranch this afternoon. She has a proposition for you." "What kind of proposition?" Jake asked warily. "The kind that might change your life," Davies said simply. "That is, if you're interested in honest work and a chance to build something meaningful." An hour later, Jake found himself riding beside Davies' buggy on the now familiar trail to Eagles Canyon. In daylight, the Whitmore Ranch was even more impressive than he'd imagined. Rolling pastures stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with hundreds of cattle bearing the distinctive W brand. Fenced paddocks held horses that looked like they'd stepped out of a painting, and the ranch buildings were constructed with a permanence that spoke of serious money and long-term planning. Davies led him to a side entrance of the main house, through a mudroom that was larger than most folks' entire cabins. They walked down a hallway lined with oil paintings and into a sunlit parlor where Martha Whitmore sat in a high-backed chair, looking every inch the prosperous rancher's widow. She was different from the confused woman Jake had found at the trading post. Her silver hair was neatly arranged, her dress was fine wool in deep blue, and her eyes were sharp and clear. When she saw Jake, her face lit up with genuine warmth. "There you are," she said, rising to greet him. "I was beginning to worry that Samuel couldn't find you." She gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her. "I owe you an apology, Jake." "And an explanation." Jake perched on the edge of the offered chair, hat in his hands. "Ma'am, you don't owe me anything. I was glad to help." "That's exactly why I asked you here," Martha said. "Do you know what I've learned in my 73 years, Jake? That a person's true character shows not in what they do when they're being watched, but in what they do when no one would ever know the difference." Martha leaned forward in her chair, her eyes studying Jake's face with the same clarity he'd glimpsed during their ride up the mountain. "I wasn't as confused that night as I appeared to be, Jake. Oh, I do have my foggy moments. That part was real enough, but I remember every detail of our conversation, every kindness you showed me." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Ma'am, I just did what anyone should do." "But that's where you're wrong," Martha said with a sad smile. "I sat on that porch for 3 hours before you came along. 3 hours, watching neighbors and acquaintances walk past like I was invisible. You were the only one who stopped, the only one who saw a person in need instead of an inconvenience." She stood and walked to the window overlooking the valley. "My late husband Thomas built all this from nothing, but he always said our real wealth wasn't in the land or the cattle. It was in the people we chose to trust, the character we recognized in others." She turned back to Jake. "I've been thinking about succession, about what happens to all this when I'm gone. My children passed before me, and my grandson, well, you know about that." Jake felt a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not sure I understand." "I'm offering you a position here, Jake. Not as a ranch hand, but as my assistant manager. You'd work alongside Samuel, learning every aspect of the operation. The cattle business, water rights, land management. dealing with banks and territorial officials. Martha's voice grew stronger. It's a chance to build something, to become someone important in this valley. Jake stared at her, speechless. The offer was beyond anything he'd ever imagined. A real future, security, respect. But something in him resisted. "Ma'am, that's incredibly generous, but I don't have any experience with that kind of work. I'm just a ranch hand who can barely keep himself fed." "Experience can be taught," Martha said firmly. "Character cannot. You proved yours that night on the mountain trail." She sat back down across from him. "But there's more to this offer than just a job, Jake. I want to create something that will outlast both of us." She pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it to reveal detailed drawings and plans. "I want to establish a foundation. Call it the Thornfield Whitmore Settlement Program. Its purpose would be to help young people like yourself who have potential but no opportunities. Provide them with land to homestead, capital to start businesses, education if they want it." Jake leaned forward to study the papers, his heart racing. "This would help people like me?" "People exactly like you," Martha confirmed. "Young folks who've been dealt a hard hand, but who still choose to do right by others. Ranch hands who lose their positions through no fault of their own. Orphans aging out of territorial care with nowhere to go." Her eyes grew misty. "I see my grandson in you, Jake. The young man he could have become if he'd lived. I want to honor his memory by giving others the chances he'll never have." Over the following weeks, Jake threw himself into learning the business with an intensity that surprised even Samuel Davies. He studied ledgers by lamplight, rode fence lines to understand the property boundaries, and sat in on meetings with bankers and cattle buyers. Martha proved to be a patient but demanding teacher, explaining not just what needed to be done, but why. Within 6 months, Jake was handling correspondence with territorial officials and managing relationships with the smaller ranchers who depended on Whitmore water rights. He discovered he had a natural talent for seeing solutions that benefited everyone involved, a skill that served him well when neighboring ranchers faced drought or financial difficulties. The settlement program launched the following spring. The first recipients were 3 young families and 2 single men, all given small parcels of Whitmore land along with livestock and equipment to start their own spreads. Jake helped select each recipient personally, looking for the same qualities Martha had seen in him: character over connections, heart over wealth. Years later, when Jake had become one of the most respected men in the territory and Martha had passed peacefully in her sleep, he would still make a point of riding past that old trading post in Copper Ridge. Sometimes he'd stop, remembering the confused old woman on the porch and the choice that had changed everything. Because sometimes the most important moments in life come disguised as ordinary kindness, and sometimes helping someone find their way home means finding your own path forward. 25 years had passed since that cold evening at Jameson's trading post, and Jake Thornfield now rode through Copper Ridge on a horse worth more than most men earned in a year. His clothes were fine but practical, his boots custom-made but broken in from honest work. At 44, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had built something meaningful with his life. The town had grown considerably since his youth. The arrival of the railroad 5 years earlier had brought new businesses, new faces, and the kind of prosperity that Thomas Whitmore had predicted decades before. But Jake still remembered when Main Street was just a dusty track between weathered buildings, and when a missed delivery could mean sleeping in the cold. He guided his horse, Thunder, to a stop in front of what was now called the Whitmore Community Center, the building that had once housed Jameson's trading post. Old Pete had sold out to Jake 10 years back, retiring comfortably on money that allowed him to spend his final years fishing instead of hauling freight. The building now served as headquarters for the Thornfield Whitmore Settlement Program, which had helped over 200 families establish themselves throughout the territory. Jake dismounted and walked through the familiar doors, nodding to Sarah Mackenzie, the young woman who managed the daily operations. She looked up from a stack of applications with a smile that reminded him why he'd hired her, the same determined optimism he'd once seen in Martha's eyes. 3 new applications today, Mr. Thornfield, Sarah reported. A widow with 2 children looking to start a small farm, a young blacksmith wanting to set up shop in Cedar Falls, and, she paused, consulting her notes, a 17-year-old boy who's been working odd jobs since his father died. Says he can handle horses and isn't afraid of hard work. Jake felt that familiar tug in his chest. Where's he staying now? That's the thing, he's not. Been sleeping rough for 2 weeks, trying to earn enough for a room. Sarah's voice carried the same concern Jake remembered feeling all those years ago. I told him to come back this afternoon for an interview. I'll handle that one personally, Jake said, settling into the chair behind what had once been Pete Jameson's counter. Through the window, he could see the bench where Martha had sat that evening, confused and alone. The bench was still there, though the trading post porch had been expanded into a proper covered area where people could wait comfortably. At 3 o'clock, a young man appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, looking around nervously. Jake recognized the signs immediately. The carefully patched clothes, the proud but wary posture, the way he stood like he was ready to bolt if things went wrong. The boy had the same lean frame Jake remembered from his own youth, stretched thin by hunger and uncertainty. You must be Tommy Carson, Jake said, standing to greet him. I'm Jake Thornfield. The boy's eyes widened slightly. Everyone in the territory knew that name now. Yes, sir. Miss Mackenzie said you might have work for someone like me. Sit down, son. Tell me your story. Tommy's tale was familiar. Father dead from a mining accident, no other family, surviving on whatever work he could find. But as the boy spoke, Jake heard something else. The same quiet dignity he'd carried at that age. The same determination not to ask for charity, even when charity was exactly what he needed. Tommy, Jake said finally, how would you feel about learning the cattle business? Real learning, not just hired hand work. I'm talking about understanding land management, water rights, dealing with banks and territorial officials. The boy's face lit up with hope, then immediately grew cautious. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I don't have any experience with that kind of thing. I'm just someone who knows how to work hard. Jake smiled, hearing his own words from decades past. Son, let me tell you something I learned from a very wise woman. Experience can be taught. Character cannot. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the bench where it all began. And sometimes the most important thing you can learn is that helping others isn't just good for them, it's good for your soul. The position comes with room and board at the ranch, a fair wage, and something else, Jake continued. The chance to help other young people who find themselves where you are now. Because the best way to honor the help you've received is to pass it along. Tommy Carson would go on to become one of the finest ranch managers in the territory, and eventually Jake's successor in running the settlement program. Years later, when Tommy was interviewing his own crop of hopeful young people, he would often think about that afternoon when a successful rancher took a chance on a homeless boy with nothing but determination. Jake rode home that evening as the sun set behind the mountains, thinking about Martha and the strange way life sometimes came full circle. He'd learned that wealth wasn't measured in acres or cattle, but in the number of lives you'd helped change for the better. And every time he passed that old bench, he whispered a quiet thank you to the confused old woman who had taught him that sometimes the most valuable thing you can give someone is the chance to discover who they're meant to become. In his saddlebags was a letter from the territorial governor asking Jake to consider running for the legislature, the same dream Martha had mentioned her grandson once having. Jake smiled, knowing that some dreams were worth waiting for, and that the best ones were often inherited from people who believed in you before you believed in yourself. The story had come full circle, but the ripples would continue spreading long after Jake Thornfield was gone, touching lives he would never know, in ways he could never imagine.